こんにちは皆さんお元気ですか？おもちゃのレビューの時間です。That's right, it's time. It makes me so sad that the Minus One era is mostly over. I just love this movie too much. I never wanted it to end. And luckily for me, today, right now, it doesn't have to. Because we've got a figure to review. What's up everybody, D-Man back, welcome to a brand new video, and today we're going to be doing another Godzilla Minus One figure review. This one we will be finally reviewing the SH MonsterArts Godzilla Minus One. Or as many have called it, Godzilla Minus Fun, because people generally hate this figure. It's considered to be like the worst MonsterArts figure, and I have given it a lot of thought because I've collected quite a few MonsterArts figures over the years. Not as many as most people. I'm not the biggest MonsterArts collector, but I have given it a lot of thought what I would consider to be the worst MonsterArts figure that I own, and I definitely have an answer. It is this little bastard right here, Kamata-kun, because his tail refuses to stay on. In fact, it never stayed on. Even when it was brand new, the thing didn't stay on. This thing has never worked right, and I cannot get it to just sit. I can't get it to just stay on. I cannot get it to work. What's the matter? Not the answer you were looking for? Well, that's how I feel about it. But in this one, we're going to be opening up and checking out the SH MonsterArts Godzilla Minus One. I've had this figure for quite a while now. I just have been kind of disorganized, so I never got around to it. But I'm excited to get into it because I want to see it. I hope it's good. I have a wider acceptance than most people when it comes to these kind of things. The Minus One was a little expensive, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it was like $125 to $150 in that price range, which that is more expensive than your traditional MonsterArts Godzilla figures. Typically when it's just Godzilla with no accessories, they're more in like the $80 range, it feels like. So it was a little expensive, but I do love the box art. It's got the cool golden Godzilla 2023 logo for the 70th anniversary, and it's got that classic, I think that's a Marvel Comics Godzilla logo there. Just good stuff. The actual box itself is really neat. It recaptures the glory of the Minus One poster. That's dope, man. I love the Minus One poster. I love the simplicity of it. Obviously, it's a very easy one to replicate on this box, and they've done a really good job replicating it. It looks awesome, and then just the sleekness, the cleanness, the G Minus 1.0 SHMA, just a nice crisp font there. On the top of the box, you've got the worthless viewing slot looking down in on it. I don't know why they add those. Gojira Minus One. Godzilla 2023 in blue over here. On this side, you've got Godzilla. That's, again, just looking super slick and clean. I love it. So there's Godzilla peeping through with the blue. This side's the actual full body design showing him off. That's great as well. And the back is also really neat. They've got the display images over here where it looks cool. They've got this little blurb from Yamazaki where he talks about working on the figure. I believe, and I could be wrong, I believe that might be Yuji Sakai photographed there. I'm not sure. But it's just a little thing describing how hard they worked to make it photorealistic to the movie and to make it accurate. And then they've again utilized the G-1 logo to have Godzilla viewable through the window there, which is super neat. And then on the bottom, you've got Godzilla roaring here, again, just looking super nice and clean. I don't know, man. The simplicity of the Minus One posters has been a favorite of mine since it was first revealed, and now translating that onto the box, it just makes for a box that I think is very aesthetic. But enough about the box. I'll quit stalling. Let's open it up. The only reason that I've been a little hesitant to open him, and the only reason I'm stalling a little bit, is just because I've seen a lot of reports that this thing comes broken in the box, which is that a MonsterArts issue, or is that just that the figure is fragile and shipped wrong? I guess you could say it's a MonsterArts issue because it wouldn't be packaged well enough. Like maybe they should have had it more secure in here, or I don't know, but I'm a little nervous, so I'm going to be very careful with this guy getting him out. He looks to be in good shape, at least right now. Here he is, here he is. We've got him, and he's looking all right. I think he's okay. I think he's safe. Good. It's the spines that people say come chipped. I think it's this big one in particular that breaks easy. So I'll have to be very careful with that, but he's looking pretty good straight out of the box. I think the issue comes when you compare it to the prototype, that it just doesn't live up to the prototype, as if a single one of these figures ever has from any company. I don't know of a single company whose toys looks as good as the prototypes, but I think that is kind of where the issue comes from, is that this thing just doesn't live up to the prototypes. Okay, I'm looking over this guy. I'm comparing him to the actual CG model from the movie, and I'm comparing him to the really high-res photos we have have of the figure itself, and I'm trying to see where the differences lie, and I think I kind of understand what's going on here. Was it false advertising? I've seen some people throw that around. I don't feel that way. Again, I'm really not that judgy when it comes to these MonsterArts figures. By the way, it's tradition. I kind of have to. I didn't do it yet, but I really should. The smell test, he smells different than every single other MonsterArts figure I've ever gotten. Normally they smell really chemically and really paint-esque. I don't know what he smells like. No, he just has a really dull smell to him. He just smells like plastic, man. He does not have the smell that the other ones do. I mean, I've heard some critiques of it. I'm kind of understanding where they come from, but at the same time, I'm also understanding where the figure is coming from. And like I said, I do have a lower standard, I think, when it comes to these things, just because I just think it's super freaking cool, man. Not only is it my favorite Godzilla design, and I absolutely love to have a highly articulated version of it, but I just love to have a nicely sculpted one as well. Nothing against the Bandai one, which I have. I'll be showing them off in the figure comparisons here, but side by side, there is a really big difference. The Bandai one's great. It's very cute. I like it. It's good for a Bandai figure, but I don't know. I really love the MonsterArts aesthetic. I like their figure line in general. I like having the highly articulated figures, and I think this one just looks super cool. It's, again, my favorite Godzilla design. It would be kind of hard for me to be disappointed with it. The only way I could really be disappointed with it is if the paint job was worse than it is, and for me, the paint job's looking fine. So from what I'm seeing here and from what I'm looking at in these prototype images, like I said, this is the prototype used to market the figure, and it does have a lot more detailing in very specific areas. Like, I can see the sculpt is a lot more rich on the neck of Godzilla. The front of Godzilla's neck has a lot more richness on the prototype, whereas here, it is a little cheap. It's got this line running down kind of his Adam's apple area that is part of the sculpt, it seems, but it can almost be confused for a seam in the plastic. I don't think that's what it is, though. I do think that's supposed to be there. And then I can see areas like on the bulk of his forearm, he's got a certain depth to the prototype that he doesn't have in person. It's a little smoother in person than it is there. And the reason that I would imagine that these issues exist is because the prototype's made to look really good for the photos, and then these ones that go to mass market, they want them to be a little more flexible. So it's possible that they kind of had to smooth some of those areas down just a touch. That'd be my guess, because you want him to be able to articulate, you want him to be able to move, and he can move and articulate pretty well. He can get his arms into those slashing the Nichigeki theater poses, do his big tail strike. I think that's probably where you're seeing those issues. Same with the front of the neck. The reason the front of the neck would have some of that depth smoothed out is just so that he can look down a little more and have a little bit more range with his neck. This is such a sharp design that there are some areas where it's kind of hard to get him to move in the ways that you'd like. For instance, if you want to get him to turn side to side, like if you want him to be getting to looking side to side, you actually have to move his back to create these big wedges. Otherwise, spines like these two spines are going to click into each other and they are gonna break. So if you want him to turn side to side, you have to first make him look down so that you can then shift the body, and then you can sit him back up. And when you do that, be very careful when you're sitting him back up. Otherwise, these spines are gonna clink into each other. They're gonna snap. That's one of the reasons you're seeing the spine snap so much, because the Minus One design has probably the biggest spines out of any Godzilla, maybe other than 2000. And they are certainly thinner than 2000s. They are the thinnest spines a Godzilla has had. So if you don't want them to snap, and you want to be very careful with it, and because they are so thin in the movie and they're so thin on the toy, you do have to have a certain level of awareness of the spine placement that you don't normally have to on a MonsterArts Godzilla. It was no different than with the Shin Godzilla, which had incredibly fragile spines. It's just that here the issue is even more amplified because they're even longer than they were on that Shin Godzilla. Going over the figure, getting into his details here, I think this sculpt is really impressive. It captures the sharpness of the model from the movie. Pulling up the model side by side, it looks really decent. He's got a lot of my favorite core features of this Godzilla. The stretched mandible between the jaws, which is cool. Those very sharp and aggressive teeth. The face looks perfect, man. The face got that very aggressive look to it. Going down the neck and into the body here, I really love the chest piece. The chest really looks like the one from the movie where it's got this bulging part where his two scales are just sticking out kind of aggressively off of his chest. You got the sunken in part in the middle of the body and then going into the underbody where he's got those big ridges running down the front. The legs have these deep crevices, like almost a split through the leg. The muscle is super well defined. And then it goes into the foot where you've got individually sculpted toes that are all separately articulated. That's crazy. And the feet are just enormous, which is a big staple of this Godzilla. The spines look phenomenal. They look just like the ones from the movie. They captured the size and scale of Godzilla's spines in the film very well as that sort of jagged, unpredictable nature of them. They're actually raised a little bit. So this reminds me of the statue that was made for Godzilla Minus One. The statue made for Minus One did feature the tooth-like roots that go on the bottom of Godzilla's spines where the spine connects to the back. Now, in the film itself, those tooth-like roots are only exposed when Godzilla charges up and his spines eject into place. But this has been common for both the full-sized Godzilla statue that they made that's human-sized. It was also seen on the smaller Godzilla model and is now seen on this figure here. I imagine it would be on this guy too, on the Bandai one, if the Bandai one had a little more detailing on it, because it seems like they're probably reusing the same CG sculpt for all of it. And this is based on the CG sculpt from the film, and I can tell because it's got a lot of good details. The way that all of the different spines clash into each other. You can only have this level of accuracy if you are pulling it from the film itself, as well as the texturing on the spines themselves, which looks great. Going through the bottom here, his tail's got nice texturing on it. There's a certain richness and depth to the good MonsterArts figures that this definitely captures. I think the sculpt is a 10 out of 10, even in the areas where they've had to smooth it for articulation purposes. I will take the functionality over the texture, simply because I appreciate what they're trying to do, and I appreciate that it makes my life a little easier in getting them to articulate. Before we get into articulation, I do want to talk a bit about paint. Now, this is where I feel like the prototype really shines as opposed to the actual figure in hand. The prototype was a little lighter gray, looked a little more like the brownish color of the movie, whereas this definitely has a stronger charcoal gray, throwing back to the origins of Godzilla. Now, in the film, Godzilla actually does have a generally pretty charcoal gray sculpt, as you can see with the official render here, and that's what this does remind me of, is the official render without the film lighting. But with the lighting in the film, generally Godzilla is more brown than gray, as you can see kind of captured in the prototype images. Other than that though, I really think the only areas that the prototype outshines the original here is the face. There's clearly a bit higher attention to detail to the mouth, the face itself, the teeth, than you see on the actual figure. My eyes are looking in the right direction. They look pretty good. They're a little darker than the actual Godzilla from the film, which eyes were a little brighter yellow. Other than that, the only real area I can see that the prototype outshines is the scar on the cheek. Unfortunately, they've kind of painted under where the scar is, so he does have the scar. It is sculpted into his face. This is the scar that he gets when Shikishima blows his face up at sea. The scarred texture in the film is a brighter color than the rest of the body, and they've painted that brighter color. They've just painted it right under the scar, rather than on the prototype they paint around it. In the film, it is more around the scar than under it. Maybe I just don't have the highest of standards, but I think the paint's really solid. It's got a good color overall. He's not aggressively bright. It's not glossy. There's nothing weird about it like with the Shin Godzilla. It looks pretty solid to me. The feet are painted really well. I like the brown highlights on it. It goes very nicely with the darker color. I do kind of wish they continued it a little more throughout the tail. Other than that, I think they've done a very good job adding the highlights where they add them. I also like that they painted his elbow shards a brighter color as well. Turns out if you're playmates, that's an easy thing to miss. As far as articulation goes, this is where it's kind of like, I don't know. Theoretically, this is a very articulated figure. Mine's pretty stiff. You gotta kind of work with him to get him into poses. And I'm assuming that's gonna be with most people's, but I will take the stiffness of the joints over looser joints any day. Oh my god. I can't stand it when I have a MonsterArts figure that can't stay together. Freaking Kamata-kun being the prime example. At least with the arms, I've got a nice free range of motion where I don't feel like I'm worried at all, but I am generally pretty worried about articulating the body because of the chunky spines, how fragile they seem. That's what freaks me out with the articulation, is I don't love the idea of moving the body too much, just because you do have to, like I said earlier, bend down and then twist around, and then be very careful about when you're putting him back into his upright position, making sure none of the spines are going to clash into each other. That's a bit of a hassle. I don't really know how you could get around that with this design. This isn't the most toyetic designed Godzilla they've ever made. That would be the next Godzilla that was designed. This one looked great in the movie, and you do have to be careful with it, which makes sense given how stiff Godzilla's model is in the film. Godzilla moves very stiff in the movie, and so it kind of makes sense that with the toy you'd have to move him very stiff as well. But there is so many great details with the articulation that I'm really in love with. His mouth can open nice and wide, that's fantastic, and then you can raise his tongue as well. He's got an articulated tongue that can go right up into the middle of the mouth. I love whenever they articulate the tongues. That's such a cool little detail that MonsterArts does. Having individually articulated rounded toes is a first for MonsterArts, I believe, and it leads to Godzilla being able to have these really wide feet that perfectly capture how enormous they feel during his assault on Ginza. And that's a level of attention to detail that you don't see MonsterArts give with most of their Godzilla figures. They're not putting in that level of detail with most of their Godzilla toys, so I love that that's here. I believe there's 46 points of articulation, which feels like a whole lot to me. That definitely feels like a lot. And I do think he's got a decent range of motion if you're patient enough to work with him. This is definitely not a figure I would get for somebody any younger than like 16. Like if I got this thing when I was 15, I'd be breaking it. I'd probably be breaking this thing when I was 16 as well. I don't think I really fully appreciated these figures until I was like 17 and I stopped messing with them as loosely as I was. Like I damaged my Shin Godzilla because I'd used it in stop motion. And it's not because I used it in stop motion, it's because I used it so loosey-goosey. I didn't think about it. This is one that you gotta think about, otherwise you're gonna cause some damage to it. There's a bunch of figures I could compare this guy to, but I wanted to get out the Bandai Godzilla Minus One just to show them off. The Bandai one's obviously much more simplistic, smooth all over. It's a brighter gray color. The brown's nice on the Bandai one, and they've definitely carried that idea over into the bigger one as well. Obviously, you can see the MonsterArts one just does that a little better, as you'd hope. The MonsterArts one's eyes are a little smaller, so it doesn't have the room for the detail that the Bandai one does, but the MonsterArts one's eyes do look a little more photoreal. Both of them are very nicely sculpted and actually pair very well together. They're about the same size with the MonsterArts one just being a little larger, and they do complement each other very well. I think this is probably the best a Bandai figure has ever really held up against its MonsterArts counterpart in my experience. Just for the sake of the Minus One collection, here he is next to my Movie Monster Series Bandai Godzilla 2023, and then here he is towering over my Godzilla Odo Island version from Godzilla Minus One. That's the pre-evolved Godzilla, and these two also look pretty cool next to each other. That's a dope pairing right there as well. Just because he's Minus One, I wanted to get out the SH MonsterArts Godzilla 1954, and you can see that they've increased the scale for the Minus One, so while he's actually about the same size as the 54 Godzilla, the figure stands much taller than the 54 Godzilla, as the old Showa figures from MonsterArts used to be made on a smaller scale, and you can see here that they have made enormous improvements with the articulation all around. While the 54 is easier to pose, it definitely feels a lot less fragile. You don't have to be as careful with the 54 one as you do with the Minus One. They have added more articulation in places like the toes and all over the body, and that's also a result of the new Godzilla being CGI rather than based on a suit, which had very limited motion. Minus One's closest relative is the Heisei Godzilla, so here's the Godzilla 1995 Rebirth version from SH MonsterArts to show those guys off as well. They've fixed a lot of the gapping issues that you used to get with these old MonsterArts figures, although again, this old one feels more sturdy. The articulation's much easier to work with than it is with the new one, although the paint's a little more limited, also as a result of this Godzilla having a much more limited color scheme than the new one. Here's my Shin Godzilla. I took the tip of his tail off. It'll be in the actual B-roll I filmed. Half of the tail on my Shin Godzilla doesn't hang on very well just because I cracked the base back in the day when I was making stop motion with this guy. I cracked the base that this plugs into. Here they are next to each other. The Shin Godzilla is a lot taller than the Godzilla Minus One, which makes sense as he should be, although not to scale. Overall, just better all the way around. The Shin Godzilla is kind of smooth, unrendered in certain areas, like the legs don't have the texture and the depth that the Minus Ones do. He's got a glossier look overall than the Minus One does. He's a little more stylistic, whereas the Minus One is a little more of a literal adaptation of the character from the film. So there's the differences there. I do think they've improved since 2016. I know many people would disagree with me and say the day of MonsterArts is over. These figures suck now. I think people are just more cynical now. I do think they've made improvements over the years. And then the final figure comparison, I know there's so many here. Here is SH MonsterArts Godzilla 2021. This is the newest SH MonsterArts Godzilla that I have. I wanted to square these two off because these are the two newest Godzillas that I own from MonsterArts. Godzilla vs. Kong versus Godzilla Minus One. Who would win? Comment below and let me know. And why is it most definitely Monsterverse? Just because he's so much bigger. Although I think if you scaled Minus One up, he might be a little more destructive, I think. But there's the two of them next to each other, looking pretty solid. Seeing the two of these guys next to each other makes me feel like they did put more effort and care and attention to detail to the Minus One than they did to the Monsterverse Godzilla. He just looks a little more accurate to the one from the movie than the Monsterverse Godzilla does. There's a level of depth on the legs and the body sculpt that you're not getting on the Monsterverse one. I just think it's overall a higher level of attention to detail. And I do think this is a very high quality Godzilla toy. So does this thing deserve its Godzilla Minus Fun legacy? I don't think so. Maybe it's just because I'm not a full-time toy reviewer or critic. I've got lighter standards than most people. It's just easier to please me with these things. Maybe I got an exception. Mine looks pretty solid overall. I don't know. People tend to say that the ones that I get look generally better than most people's. I don't know. I feel like it's kind of weird if I was just getting the exception every single time. I think this is very decent. The sculpt is awesome. The paint job's pretty good, although it could be a little better in some areas. And the articulation is very decent, but a little worrying. It's a little scary to move this guy. He just feels dangerous. Overall, I'd give the Godzilla Minus One an 8 out of 10. The only things that I could think you could do a little better is somehow finding a way to make the spines a little sturdier. I'm really curious if Super 7 finds a way to work around that. And then having a little more attention to detail with some of the paint job. I think that could be another thing where maybe they could shine a little better. Just the fact that they missed the scar on the cheek is a little telling. But other than that, I think it's really solid. I think it looks pretty much like the prototype ones. I think it looks just like some of these models from the movie. And I'm happy to have my favorite Godzilla in a highly articulated high-end line. So that's it, an 8 out of 10. Do you have the SH MonsterArts Godzilla Minus One? If so, comment below and let me know what you think of it. I'd be very curious to hear your guys' thoughts on this guy. Do you hate this thing? Are you one of the many haters this guy has, or are you like me, pretty satisfied with it? I'd love to hear. As always, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. If you want to support the Patreon, you can use the link in the description below where you can get early access to content, access to the Discord community, and more. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you guys next time for the next one. D-Man out.